One of the most hidden chapters of American history is the Mexican repatriation that took place during the Great Depression in the 1930s. In this case, repatriation is a whitewashing term used to cover up an act of violent ethnic cleansing that consisted of unconstitutional deportation and forced immigration of Mexican Americans living in the U.S. to Mexico. Mexico's negotiations with the U.S. to organize and execute the process of repatriation leaves the country's conscience no clearer than that of the states. For both nations, the violence of Mexican repatriation added another layer to the foundation used by both countries today to uphold nativist, anti-immigrant sentiment and push aggressive policies against foreigners seeking refuge in their country. Today, we'll look at what led to repatriation, what repatriation looked like, and how the effects of repatriation are still felt present day. Since most articles do this through the perspective of the U.S. and focus on critiquing the U.S., we will be highlighting Mexico's role in repatriation. Let's start with the Mexican Revolution, which was built upon promises of economic equity and social justice. Even so, poverty continued to haunt the average Mexican in post-war Mexico, leading Mexican citizens to conduct a never-before-seen 1 million border crossings into the U.S. during the 1920s. The fragile state of Mexico was perfect for U.S. agribusiness, who were in search of temporary, cheap, marginalized, and seasonal workers. As for Mexico's perspective, nationalists were worried about how to socially and economically develop the country if its citizens and laborers were drained by immigration. The general public also opposed labor migration to the U.S., arguing that they were traitors for expanding American wealth rather than building revolutionary Mexico. Eventually, political elites decided that labor immigration was allowed under the Mexican Constitution of 1917, and U.S. remittances would improve economic and political stability in Mexico. Now let's fast forward a few years to the 1929 stock market collapse. See, the cyclical and racist nature of capitalism calls for periodic economic recessions and depressions. Because of this, the working class, often made up of black and non-black people of color, become scapegoats for the rich's wrongdoings. Determined to provide real jobs for real Americans, politicians and businesses decided to encourage Mexicans to voluntarily leave the country and go to Mexico. On the U.S.'s part, this looks like scare tactics and raids at public spaces, the creation of special railroad trains, roundups by local agencies, and empty promises. All of these actions were in some form or another supported by Mexico, who wanted to reap the benefits of modern business methods which their compatriots living in the United States have learned to help the community return to propensity. In fact, Mexico began to seek repatriates years before the stock market collapse. This article expresses nativist sentiment in various parts, and while the discrimination could be interpreted to be directed at only white Americans, assuming this is dangerous because in reality, the undesirables are the unskilled who do not fit the requirement of being farmers with modern agricultural knowledge. Mexico promised repatriates and their children reduced transportation costs, subsidized colonization ventures, and guaranteed loans. Sadly, the country fell short on its promises due to the non-stop pull of people coming into the country, thus straining resources and creating backlash among local residents. The skilled workers Mexico hoped for ended up being the most discontented, and therefore many felt they were worse in Mexico than the U.S. The combined efforts of both countries resulted in an estimate of about 500,000 to 2 million unconstitutional deportations, and about 60% of those deported were U.S.-born Mexicans or American citizens. So why does this matter now? Francisco Valderrama, co-author of the most cited book on Mexican repatriation, Decade of Betrayal, argues that the lack of awareness of the repatriation is consistent with the general invisibility of Latinx civil rights deprivations throughout much of U.S. history. Erasing Mexican Americans in the U.S. was without a doubt one of the main goals of the repatriation project and continues to be practiced by not requiring this major part of the Great Depression to be taught in schools. While approximately one-third of Mexicans in the U.S. were lost under this project, the goal of erasure is far from accomplished. Memory of this trauma and abuse exists, if not within the institutions or academy, then within the people and their descendants. What the project did accomplish in the U.S. is the labeling of Mexicans as unassimilable and the practice of othering. This practice continues today both in the U.S. and Mexico as both countries continue to be destinations for refugees across the world. The U.S. and Mexico displaced, killed, and psychologically traumatized entire generations during the Great Depression in the name of economic advancement. This has set the precedent for the continued harm both countries continue to inflict on people in need that they close their doors to and actively push out. The history of Mexican repatriation cannot continue to be hidden if we wish to end anti-immigrant sentiment and practices.